And joining us now for more is Reserves IDF Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus. He's the former IDF International spokesperson. He's now a senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, we just heard from the Supreme Leader and President Trump. As the saying goes, this time it's personal. This kind of exchange, does you think it bringing us any closer to, for example, a U.S. military action against Iran?
I think it adds to the strategic ambiguity of what the U.S. is going to do, what President Trump is going to order. And I think that the most important parts are the location of military assets, U.S. military assets and capabilities in the region, which have been building clearly over the last few days. And I think that within a matter of days, maybe a week, the U.S. will have all that it needs in position to take meaningful action against Iran, which I personally believe is coming.
All right. Well, let me ask you, what kind of action could we expect? It does seem as if at this stage, perhaps the U.S. won't be targeting Khamenei himself personally, though we never know with President Trump. But what kind of action do you anticipate?
Well, at this stage, I think that the U.S. will have a pretty wide availability of different tools and different actions. I don't think that we will see a Maduro operation because it is much more difficult to get into Iran and get beyond layers of defense in order to actually apprehend a leader. So I would put that aside. And I don't think that we're going to see ground units. I think that we will see eventually standoff fire from aerial platforms, from naval platforms that will hit specific targets that are related to the oppression of the Iranian people. The Basij headquarters, the IRGC headquarters, and other key nodes of command and control, and really the centers of power of the Iranian regime, the same forces that have been basically mowing down Iranians on the streets. We're looking at everywhere between 8,000 and 15,000 people, depending on different reports. It's very difficult to get information out, but we know that thousands have been murdered, mowed down on the streets. I assume that these will be the forces that will be the first target, and then an anticipated Iranian retaliation, whether it's against American troops and assets in the region, and if it includes Israel or not, we'll have to wait and see. And then a follow-up, which I think will target the Supreme Leader Khamenei himself and actually aim by military force to bring down the regime and to allow the protesters who have been out on the streets day in, day out, but then mowed down in the most brutal fashion, to give them the kind of the cavalry is here, and let them know that now is the time to actually take back their country and free themselves from 47 years of the Islamic regime's horrible oppression of the Iranian people.
And how do you expect the regime to react, certainly to an initial attack, or something like the restrained, almost symbolic response we saw last year, or something more serious that, of course, is likely to target Israel?
Well, I think that the U.S. and probably also Israel will be watching that very closely, watching for the indicative signs of opening of silos, preparation of launching of ballistic missiles, and anything that will be indicative of Iranian intentions to fire towards Israel or to fire towards major U.S. assets. If that happens, Israel and the U.S. will have capabilities at hand in order to preempt that. So I don't know exactly what the Iranians will do. I think they have a pretty limited toolbox available, as opposed to a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, we would have been talking about, the entire region, about Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and proxies in Syria. But today they're left with missiles and the IRGC and perhaps overseas attacks, none of which are going to save the Iranian regime from what is coming, what I believe is coming, and that is an onslaught on the headquarters, the command and control, and the ability of the Iranian regime to continue to oppress the Iranian people.
Yeah, we do know the U.S. is keeping the diplomacy option on the table, and we heard Steve Witkoff, the special envoy, President Trump's special envoy, just the other day, speaking at a conference, saying we would like to still negotiate with the regime. We even gave out a list of conditions. Some of them were acceptable to Israel. Noticeable, not on the list of conditions, was any move towards protecting the protesters or any kind of real fundamental
different
change
rules of engagement and different use of force by the regime. Yeah.
Right. So how likely? I mean, in Israel, you're hearing an expression in Hebrew, "litkof" or "witkof," to attack.
Yes.
Litkof or Witkoff diplomacy.
Yes, well, he is the diplomacy guy. It'll be very surprising if he were to speak about military options. His toolbox is the diplomatic one, and he's someone who has brought significant achievements in the Gaza part of the world and other areas. But I don't think that is where we are going. I think that the actions, the brutality, the way that the Iranian regime chose to oppress the uprising and the protesters, to basically mow them down in cold blood with Basij and IRGC forces, with foreign mercenaries that they brought in from Iraq, from Afghanistan and other places, that is one bridge too far, that is one bloodbath too far. And I think that the personal attacks and the insults out of Khamenei's Twitter account and other accounts against President Trump, he's only digging his hole deeper, and I don't think that those are very wise decisions that have been made to communicate and to entice personally President Trump.
And Jonathan, even if there was such a serious attack, as you said, against key points of the leadership, even taking out perhaps the supreme leader, would that lead to regime change? We know how powerful and entrenched, for example, the IRGC and its various bodies are.
Indeed. And I think that the most important back-channel conversations and the other scenarios that I'm sure are happening now as we speak are different parts of the Iranian regime, the IRGC specifically, but perhaps other parts, perhaps the army. I don't think the Basij, but army and IRGC. There may be, we may see an Egyptian variant of an Iranian Assisi taking power and relieving the supreme leader of his authority and saying, I want to save the country from a foreign onslaught. I want to save us the destruction that is coming, that you have brought upon us. And as a defensive measure, we're now taking control, and this will be a transit to some type of other governance. That's also a point. I agree with you. The Iranian regime is entrenched. It is brutal. It has had a lot of time to build an oppressive system that is very powerful and still effective. They came close to, breaking, but when that came, they simply notched up the violence,
right.
Used, basically tools of war, machine guns and assault rifles, and mowed down their own people on Iranian streets. That is how desperate they were, which I think is indicative of how weak they really are when they resort to that level of violence. So bottom line, yes, powerful, yes, very varied, and there are different centers of power in the Iranian regime. I wouldn't rule out a scenario of a general or some other strong man that will come in and say, let's save us the trouble of an Iraq scenario or a Libya scenario, and let's transition into something that is a different type of regime, and let's not go all the way of having to have mayhem and anarchy on the streets, which could follow if kinetic force is applied on the centers of gravity of the Iranian regime, and then the people take over. That could become very messy.
All right, could become messy, but of course Israel, in this case perhaps, would even prefer the devil it doesn't know compared, since Iran has been for too long the devil it does know.
Indeed.
And we'll have to see if that happens. Jonathan, stay with us. We want to move on to another certainly pressing security issue for Israel. Now, the so-called day after for Gaza that was promised by the Trump peace plan is beginning to take shape, and some of it is perhaps not to Israel's liking. Now, the executive board that will oversee the governance of Gaza has including the Turkish foreign minister and Qatar's prime minister. This is despite Israel's strong opposition to either of those nations having any such role. Ali Shat, chosen by the Trump administration to lead the body that will actually administrate post-war Gaza, is a former deputy minister in the Palestinian Authority, which Israel has also rejected. And these moves are being made without any clear sign yet that Hamas plans to lay down its weapons. That's a clear precondition for phase two to proceed. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu has agreed to join Trump's board of peace of world leaders that will sit above these bodies. But at the Knesset this week, he did publicly acknowledge Israel's differences with the U.S. over Gaza.
כן, ואני רוצה להדגיש עוד משהו. חיילים טורקיים וחיילים קטרים לא יהיו ברצועה. יש לנו ויכוח מסוים עם ידידינו בארצות הברית על הרכב מועצת היועצים, כך קוראים לזה, מועצת היועצים שתלווה את התהליכים בעזה. עכשיו, יש ויכוח, אני שם אותו כאן על הבמה, על הפודיום.
Jonathan, a rare acknowledgement publicly of the Prime Minister of a difference with the Trump administration, but perhaps some say moving the goalpost. Now it's no Turkish Qatari officials, though he acknowledges the differences. How serious a disagreement is this now between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump over the governance of Gaza?
I wouldn't know how serious the disagreement between the two leaders are, but I would say that between total victory and the completion of the goals that Israel, the Israeli cabinet, 2 years and a few months ago set forward to achieve, the complete destruction of Hamas, relieving them of control of the Gaza Strip and getting back all of the hostages, which was added later. Out of those 3 goals, only one has been achieved, almost achieved. We're still waiting for the body of Ran Gvili.
Right, and you're still, I should note, you're still wearing the hostage pin, as Ran Gvili has still not been, his remains have not been returned.
I mean, the suffering of those families won't end when the bodies come home. So I don't know when I'll take it off, but I think definitely until Ran Gvili's his body's returned home, I think I'll continue to wear it. But the difference, the abyss between what Israel wanted to achieve, set forward to achieve, and what we have today is, I think, hugely understated in what the Prime Minister said. This is not total victory. This is not Israel in control and in the driving seat of the situation. This is foreign hostile nations that are now in our backyard, and they've gotten a key from another landlord, and that is the United States of America. And I think that Israel finds itself in a position where what this basically means, the bottom line, what this means is that we're going to have an ongoing conflict with Gaza under Hamas rule, and that this is far, far from done. Future generations of Israeli soldiers will have to be called upon to fight in Gaza because Hamas is not dismantled and it is not going away. And as long as Hamas is there, whether it is directly currently in name or just one step below the surface, they're still going to be there. They're in control. They'll control education. They will still have their weapons, and they will rebuild because that is their focus. Their focus is jihad. Their focus is the destruction of the State of Israel. And until they are dismantled and disarmed, we are going to continue to have a problem. And what we're seeing now, the day after in Gaza, it is not according to Israel's goals. It is not Israel in the driving seat. There are other powers and parties that are in the driving seat. And it does not at all compute with the goals that Israel set forth to achieve after the massacre of October 7th.
Right, and you talk about Israeli soldiers having to continue to operate, to fight in Gaza, but there is a difference because there is this alternative sort of administration being set up, and you hear concern that what is developing in Gaza is a so-called Hezbollah model, where, for example, Hezbollah was operating under the cover of a Lebanese government or a pseudo-Lebanese government that did limit to some degree Israel's actions.
Yes, and the only thing missing would be a failing UN force, UNIFIL, and a weak mandate, 1701, and then, the whole charade that we saw for so many years after 2006. Yes, sadly, that's how it quacks, and that is what it looks like, and it is not to my liking. I think we are far from where we need to be. It is not where I hoped we would be in terms of the sacrifices that were made in Israeli blood. Young men, mostly men who sacrificed on the battlefield, thousands of wounded, hundreds of killed on the battlefield, and this is not the political diplomatic achievement that will ensure the absolute goal of making sure that we won't have to fight there again in this generation or the next one. With this current framework, it looks much more likely that Hamas will stay in power, have access to their weapons, and then eventually grow into another formidable fighting force, a terrorist army, and challenge Israeli security again. That is what we needed to prevent. That is what October 7 was all about.
But how much latitude does the government, the Israeli government, have at the same time it is having to work, and to tie it back to the Iran issue, when it is working with the United States and counting on the U.S. to assist it on, for example, the defense of Israel against a possible Iranian attack?
So I think you touch on the most important trade-off that Israel is making here. It's a cognitive decision that Israel is making, basically trading off Gaza and saying, I have an opportunity here to do major strategic long-term change with regards to our main enemy and our most lethal nation-state enemy, which is the Islamic Republic of Iran. There is a window of opportunity with President Trump, and the interests are aligning. Let's focus on that, and let's, swallow a very, very bitter pill, which this day after in Gaza and the Board of Peace, Turkish involvement, Qatari involvement, and basically a window dressing of a Hamas government, which is what we're going to get, Palestinian Authority and pseudo-Hamas. That's a very bitter pill, but it looks as if Israel is willing to swallow that bitter pill, hoping that it will make significant achievements against Iran and not wanting to jeopardize those achievements with the US and saying, okay, if that's the price that we have to pay, then it looks as if the Prime Minister has made that decision and he's willing to pay that price, which means that future generations of Israelis will have to fight in Gaza. That is the bottom line.
All right, it's sort of an Iran first, Gaza later, perhaps, strategy. But as you said, this is something that, unfortunately, other future generations of young Israelis may have to contend with. Jonathan Conricus, thank you so much for joining us
Thank you,
on our ILTV Security Brief.